Well, for more on the ongoing Brexit talks, or lack thereof, I'm joined by Joe Minarik. He's the Vice President and Director of Research at the Committee for Economic Development. Welcome back, Joe.
Good to be here, Rachelle.
So as we're seeing, slow going so far in the Brexit talks, how much consensus has there been so far, and what's really stalling negotiations?
It may be that they're waiting to be backed up against a deadline. They've got 2 years to come to a conclusion. This kind of a negotiation has never taken place before. The European Union was not thought to be a hotel. It was thought to be a little bit more like a condominium. If you bought in, you were expected to stay there for a while. So having to deal with a separation is something that hasn't happened before. You've had years in which Britain and the rest of the Union have forged ties at the business level, people moving across the border, and now all of a sudden people are beginning to figure out how complicated it is to pull those kinds of relationships apart, and it's not going to be easy.
Now, we know that the EU was hoping to get some more clarity on May's Brexit stance in her speech to her Conservative Party's conference on Wednesday. Were there any?
Not really. The Prime Minister has talked about trying to figure out the financial settlement part of this divorce. There'll be arguing over money as far as that's concerned. But in terms of many of the priorities in the negotiation, Britain has to decide what it really wants. You can argue over control of immigration. You can argue over tariff terms. You can argue over the flow of capital and businesses' rights to operate across borders. Right now, it doesn't seem that Britain has made up its mind what it really wants out of this negotiation.
Now, we know one thing that the UK has been pushing for is trying to talk about a free trade deal before everything else. How likely is that, though?
Well, it's going to be difficult because part of the EU's perspective on this negotiation is they want to make sure that all of their members are comfortable that Britain is not profiting from leaving the Union. There are issues there relating to where particular EU agencies in Britain are going to go. There are issues with respect to regulations, with respect to labor protections. So many of the member states of the EU are going to be watching to see how this negotiation goes. So the EU is going to have to follow a tough line.
Now, is the EU, from a negotiation standpoint, having the same united front, or can we expect perhaps some certain fractions with the EU to perhaps side with Britain in an attempt to really speed this through?
Well, the EU is going to be trying to avoid that more than anything else. And also, of course, when you take the European Union and you look at Britain, the fact that Britain wanted to withdraw and voted to withdraw is not going to endear Britain to the rest of the European Union. So one would expect that in this negotiation, the position is going to be that Britain will have to pay something of a price to get out. And that may tend to keep the European Union together in the negotiation.
And speaking of keeping them together, we know that French President Emmanuel Macron is really trying to integrate the EU more. How much does that factor into the negotiation process with Brexit?
Well, you would want to give the Prime Minister the benefit of the presumption that what he's trying to do is to advance Europe. But by looking past Brexit and saying, talking about what it is that he wants to achieve for Europe after Brexit, he is in effect saying in the negotiating process, well, we're past this. You, Britain, you're going to have to strike a deal. You're going to have to come to us and tell us what it is that you want out of this negotiation. So it probably is not primarily motivated by the negotiation, but it seems to say to Britain, we're strong and we're going to be able to get along without you.
Now, this is still early days, relatively early days in this two-year process. We have May saying no deal is better than a bad deal. If this does potentially keep dragging on until the 11th hour, what sort of impact is that going to have for the economies in the EU and the UK?
The one thing that a business will not want to do is to make a commitment to an investment, an expansion policy of some sort that might, at the end of this unpleasant negotiation, put capital in place that cannot do business with the rest of Europe. Europe and Britain trade very actively, and it will inhibit decision making, as does any uncertainty. But the kind of uncertainty that we're talking about here for a British firm or a European firm that is thinking about expanding or establishing new operations in Britain will tend to freeze that decision making. And so as you get closer and closer to the deadline, it is going to become tougher and tougher for the British economy with